Guys, welcome back to the channel. Space Monkey Mafia here, and today is Sunday, so that means it's Spooky Sunday, and we're going to be doing Tales from our NoSleep because why not, and it's good stuff. I think for next week I'm going to pick up the one I mentioned before, Mall Security Guard. It ended really weirdly, so I'm probably just going to do the first 2 or 3 and let you guys come up with your own ending, or, go read it yourselves, but I was pretty disappointed in the ending, so I'm not going to read the ending. But today we're going to be doing The Monster in My Friend's Basement. Have you ever known someone that considered you their best friend, even though to you they were barely more than an acquaintance? When I was a kid, that friend was Henry. I was always nice to him when I saw him in class, but we never really spent time with each other outside of school. That's why I was so surprised when he asked me to come spend the night at his house for his birthday celebration. To say that it was awkward would be putting it mildly. I was either the only guest invited or the only one that actually showed up. His father, who I learned was raising Henry as a single parent, was a large but quiet man. After he dropped the store-bought cake onto the kitchen table, Henry and I were pretty much left to our own devices. Henry was a big horror fan. He showed me his room that was covered in posters of the Wolfman and Dracula. He had stacks of worn-out EC comics in every corner of the room. Instead of playing with G.I. Joes, he had me play with a Barbie doll while he chased her with some alien creature action figure. It wasn't my favorite birthday party. When the hour got late, Henry's dad told us to shut off the light and go to bed. I couldn't have been happier. I was ready for this night to be over. But, naturally, Henry had other ideas. Within seconds of his father's footsteps fading away, Henry had a flashlight in his hand and was ready to start telling scary stories. Henry told me about the time his dad was attacked in the woods by a deformed humanoid creature. The monster had pounced on him and started to claw at his face, but he was able to overpower it and crushed its windpipe. But the creature kept coming back. The monster could show up at any moment and attack Henry's dad. Every time the outcome was the same. Henry's dad was able to overpower and kill the monster, only for it to rise up again and attack him later. Eventually, the monster followed him back to their house. It waited as the family slept and attacked that night. The monster killed Henry's mother before his dad was able to strike it down. Henry's dad sat him down and tried to explain about the monster, how there was no way to stop it from coming back and that it wouldn't stop until it had taken everything from him, so he had no choice but to lock it up in the basement. He warned Henry never to go into the basement because he might accidentally let the monster out. The whole story was pretty corny. Henry seemed annoyed when I laughed and told me how it was all true. He tried to goad me into going into the basement if I thought he was lying. Luckily, Henry's dad banged on the door at that moment and told us to quiet down and go to sleep. I gladly rolled over and shut my eyes. A few hours later, I awoke to a full bladder and awkwardly felt my way along the dark hallway to try and find the bathroom. After I flushed and washed my hands, I made my way back to Henry's bedroom. I stopped dead in my tracks when I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the stairs behind the door to the basement. Henry's story may have been stupid, but when you are all alone in the dark in an unfamiliar house and it starts to come true, a silly story starts to sound a lot more plausible. So I just stood there, perfectly still, and listened as the footsteps got closer and closer to the top of the stairs. Something behind the door latched onto the doorknob and started to wiggle it back and forth. Slow at first, but it quickly became more frantic. The door began to heave in and out as the monster behind the door tried to rip it open. The beast that previously tried to stay very quiet no longer seemed to care. I could hear its inhuman zombie-like moans as it put every ounce of strength into opening that locked door. I ran as fast as I could to Henry's dad's room. I was talking a mile a minute as I was trying to explain to him that the monster was trying to get out of the basement. He practically had to shake some sense into me to get me to talk in a comprehensible manner. When he finally realized that I was trying to warn him that the monster was about to escape the basement, his eyes went wide. He told me to stay in his room and lock the door. I could see it in his face. The fear in that grown man's eyes left no doubt that Henry's story was all real. I waited, hiding under blankets in that room for what seemed like hours before he returned, along with his son. Henry's dad told me to come out to the kitchen where we could have some more cake and he would explain everything. It turned out that it was all a dumb prank. Henry had snuck out of the room when he heard me leave to go to the bathroom. It was him behind the basement door making scary noises and pretending like he was coming to rip me limb from limb. His dad made him apologize and promised never to scare me like that again. I felt like an idiot. Henry's story was so stupid, and yet I had completely fallen for his prank. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Henry and I kind of drifted apart after that. I never really considered him much of a friend to start with, so it wasn't all that difficult to start to push him away after that disaster of a birthday sleepover. In fact, Henry started to drift away from pretty much everyone after that. A few years later, we entered high school, and he never fell in with any of the cliques. When I went away to college, I started to forget all about my short-lived friendship with Henry. That's what made it all the more weird to receive a call from him last month, completely out of the blue. We hadn't spoken since high school. He told me how he had been in a car accident and was in the hospital. He wondered if I could visit. I felt terrible. I hadn't so much as thought of Henry in over a decade, but clearly he still considered me a friend after all these years. Reluctantly, my guilt about pushing him away made me agree to go visit him. He looked horrible, plaster casts on both legs and one of his arms. It would be a long time before he left a wheelchair. I sat with him for an hour, but most of that was spent in silence. It didn't take long to catch up. There just wasn't that much to talk about. In my eyes, we were never that close, and time had only deepened the gap. Henry still lived in the same house. His father had willed it to him when he died shortly after we graduated high school. Henry said he would need some help taking care of the place for a little while after he got released from the hospital. Again, I felt horrible. He clearly had no one in his life. A mere acquaintance from childhood was the only person he could ask to help him in his time of desperate need. How could I say no? So a few days later, I drove back to the hospital and picked him up. I awkwardly lifted him into my car and folded up the wheelchair so it would fit in the car. Already, I felt like I had bit off more than I could chew. How long was I expected to help him out? His house was a total wreck. It needed a new paint job, countless hours of yard work, and a new roof. It practically looked abandoned. Once inside, Henry had me take him to the kitchen, where he immediately had me open several large cans of food and slide the contents out into 2 bowls. I told him I wasn't hungry, and kind of joked that he should want something with a little more taste, having been stuck with hospital food for days, but he insisted. So I heated up the bowls and brought them back to the table. Naturally, I wasn't digging in, but I was surprised that Henry just stared at the bowl as well. He seemed lost in thought, almost like he forgot I was even there. The whole thing was very off-putting, and I found myself over and over looking to the clock and hoping that I could get away soon. Eventually, Henry broke the silence. To my surprise, he brought up that night, his birthday celebration, the last time I had been here. He asked me if I remembered that, like I could ever forget, so I just laughed and lied about what a great time I had. Then he asked if I remembered the monster in the basement. All these years, and it seemed that Henry hadn't changed at all. For a split second, it even crossed my mind that all of this was just an elaborate plan to prank me again, that he had friends ready to burst out of the basement and spray me with silly string just so Henry could laugh at me once more. But Henry was dead serious. He couldn't even lift his head to look me in the eyes as he continued to talk. He told me that the monster was real, and it was hungry. Henry had been in the hospital for a while. It had been far too long since the monster had fed. The bowls of canned food that Henry had me prepare weren't for us. He wanted me to take them downstairs. I was dumbfounded. Did he really think I was this stupid? I didn't even bother to answer him. I just stood up, grabbed my keys, and prepared to leave. If this was how Henry was going to reward my kindness, I wouldn't feel bad about abandoning. But Henry grabbed my wrist as I tried to talk away. He looked up at me with tears forming in his eyes and lips quivering as he begged me to take the food down to the basement. Please take the food down. I'll explain everything when you come back up. It will make more sense if you see it first. Something in my mind told me that I needed to do this. I wasn't afraid to go back to that basement door that had terrified me so many years ago, but I still needed closure. I needed to see that Henry was full of it and there was nothing but a normal old basement behind the door. I wheeled Henry over to the basement door and he unlocked it. He waited by the top of the staircase as I opened the door and started to descend. The smell was overwhelming, not just mildew or mold, like you would expect in an old dank basement. It was a living smell. Sweat, feces, human filth. Something was down there. I slowly made my way down the stairs. The sights and sounds of that childhood night flooded my brain as I heard my own footsteps mimicking the sound of the monster from years ago. This time, I traced the monster's steps in reverse as I practically tiptoed my way down the stairs with my shirt raised around my nostrils to try and keep the smell at bay. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. Saw them. Huddled in a dark corner at the far end of the basement. I dropped the bowls of food and then clattered to the concrete floor, alerting the others to my presence. They barely had the strength to lift their heads up and look at me. Their skin was stretched tight from starvation, revealing the curve of every bone on their body. Heads were nearly bald from malnutrition, and they were covered in scars. They looked every bit the monster that Henry had described to me that night so many years ago. But now I knew better. They were human. Beaten, abused, and tormented. But just as human as I was. Slowly they crawled towards me. I was still frozen. It was just like when I was a child. They clawed their ways across the floor, but their outstretched hands weren't coming for me. They wanted the food that was spilled around my feet. The chains that were latched tightly around their ankles stopped them well short of reaching. I looked in horror as the scars of years of struggling against those chains had created. The skin all the way up to one of their legs was red with infection. But they didn't stop trying. They stretched and pawed at the ground, trying to get just a little bit closer to the food that was just beyond their grasp. I'm ashamed to admit that I backed up and started to run up the stairs. I was stopped when they started moaning, identical to that sound I heard behind the door when I was a child. I turned and looked inside their pleading faces, their mouths empty of tongue and teeth. When I turned back around, Henry was staring down at me from the top of the staircase. He had his one good hand latched tightly around the door, ready to slam it shut. "Finish feeding them," he said coldly. I stood there, still frozen, but my mind was racing. I was terrified at what I saw down there, but not by Henry. He was the true monster here, not these things he kept locked up in the basement. But right now, Henry was no threat to anyone. Henry must have seen it in my face. He was used to controlling this pair of captives, and didn't like seeing the look of defiance on my face. He quickly slammed the door shut, and I could hear him struggling with the key as I sprinted up the stairs, 2 steps at a time. I launched my shoulder into the door, knocking Henry over and spilling him out onto the floor before he could lock me down there in his basement. The moans from the captives in the basement still echoed behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran straight out the front door and immediately called the police. Henry was surprisingly forthcoming when they interrogated him. He hadn't planned on locking me down there with him. He wanted me to join him, to become part of this, just like he had done when his father had first shown him the basement and its captives to him so many years ago. It turns out that the monster in the basement was his father's own rage. His father had held kidnapped girls in the basement for decades. Abusing them allowed him to keep his monstrous side safe and hidden from the world. When Henry was old enough, he recognized the monster inside of him and allowed Henry to join him in that basement. Henry hadn't planned on adding me to his list of captives. He wanted me to join him as his new partner while he recovered from his injuries. I am tormented by my memories of that night, the sleepover at Henry's house. Even though I eventually became their savior, I'll never be able to forget that I am directly responsible for preventing their escape all those years ago. I doomed them to decades more time trapped as captives in that basement because when I heard them, I ran and alerted their captor. I allowed the monster to continue to thrive in that basement. That's a yikes. Yeah, so, spooky story for today. That was it. Very spooky. I'm not even sure if the kid can really be blamed for any of this, because his dad probably never told him that they were human, because he probably just kept that little monster story alive, and he may not even know better even now. It's probably just whole Stockholm Syndrome. That's not Stockholm Syndrome. It's probably just his brain's all messed up now. I mean, poor guy. Poor captives. Rough story. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the story. If you did, like, comment, subscribe. I good little YouTube stuff. Most of my stories are just Reddit, classic stuff, nice guys, nice girls. Weird stuff. Less spooky. That's just on the Sundays. But anyway, I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, I'll see you back here tomorrow. Bye.